Another somewhat exhausted coffee shop video. Somebody asked me if I feel self-conscious doing this, i.e. talking to a camera in a public place like a coffee shop. No. I'm either indifferent to, I don't know, what other people make of my behavior in public, or I'm so self-conscious that I don't really make any distinction between doing this in public and doing it where there are no witnesses at all. Which is which, who knows? But my previous video sort of was dealing with making a big deal out of one's own suffering, even if in some way it can't actually be demonstrated that your suffering really is a big deal, at least compared to anyone else's. But since we are the only ones that are experiencing our own experiences, only we can judge the depths of our own joys or sufferings, etc. Now, I'd like to ask sort of rhetorically or hypothetically, in the vein of, say, that statement, first world problems, is there any such thing as an illegitimate form of suffering? Is there anyone who can say, well, it's all very well for you to feel good about your life, about life in general, because you've got it good. Imagine being me, or imagine being that person over there. Is that really a justifiable thing to say or to ask of somebody? This idea that there are greater and lesser degrees of suffering in people in absolute terms, and some people are not allowed to, therefore, at least have less of a moral claim on feeling or dramatizing or bemoaning their own sufferings. This was dealt with in a movie by Rod Steiger, sorry, I always get those two names mixed up, where a guy who had survived, it's called The Pawnbroker, I think, a guy had survived Auschwitz, and he was now a pawnbroker in New York City after the war, and he's seeing the normal human dramas of people that require money and things like this, and just petty poverties and small problems that people in New York would have in the 1950s or 1960s or whatever. And I say petty or small compared to what he, the pawnbroker, has to face every day, and that's his memories of being, I guess, in Auschwitz or something like this, some concentration camp, sort of seeing just, like he's sort of always thinking, you're a pregnant woman and your boyfriend deserted you after breaking your heart. So, I've seen things happen to pregnant women that would make your sufferings look like nothing. Does he have the right to say that, or is that a cruel thing for him to do? Or does he even have enough information, even as an Auschwitz survivor, as a person who'd experienced it? Even he may not have enough information to say, your suffering is not valid, mine is. As I said, the previous video was about me coping with jet lag, and how I sort of, I don't know, coped with it by getting, I guess, soulful about it, or meditative, or ruminative, or even, one could even argue, wallowing in it. Sort of making it into some sort of bigger drama than it actually is. Like, look at this poor, troubled man wandering through the dark, empty streets, trying to collect his thoughts because he's so confused, and you imagine a Swedish intellectual or existentialist from the 1950s wandering around Oslo, or, Stockholm or something, it's some sort of larger drama, but still relevant to me. In other words, I can imagine that there is something drama-worthy about me just wandering around trying to collect my thoughts while in a state of jet lag. My minor suffering that is jet lag is, in some sense, ennoblable, even in a small way. But it's a good example. In fact, I really like it because jet lag is almost one of those things where you're bragging by telling people that you have it. So it's particularly, quote-unquote, illegitimate form of suffering. It's the ultimate sort of first world problem. Only people who with quite a privileged position in society can suffer from that. So by complaining about jet lag, you're actually trying to one-up everybody else. So that, it's a really good example, I think, of a type of suffering that some people may consider illegitimate, and in some ways, I hope you really bloody have it bad, buddy, that kind of thing. Reminds me again of that story from the autobiography of Malcolm X, where a white woman was overwhelmed by guilt and approached him and sort of said she was a privileged Southern white girl. And she said, "Is there anything that I, as a white person, can do to fix this horrible mess in our society?" He says, "Nope, nothing." In other words, it's more or less, you are the problem. Existentially speaking, your privilege is the problem. He regretted that deeply later in the novel, ever having done that, because he learned that, wow, white people have feelings too, and they can be just as devastated as we can, because he must have read it in her eyes or something like that when he saw the effect that his words had on her. It's a sort of seminal moment, like, wow, white people bleed. This kind of thing, which, if you've been sort of on the receiving end of the bad behavior of white people your entire life, you would get you're in a position of powerlessness. You'd often you might get this sort of resentful idea that white people not only are in a privileged position, but they're somehow inherently stronger and they don't feel things because of their wonderful privileged position. There's no way that they could possibly grasp what my suffering is like, type thing. But he, by the end of the novel, he'd understood that, wow, we're all just people. Wow. It's quite a light bulb moment for him. But I'll look at it this way. Was that privileged white girl's suffering as legitimate as an African American's in the 1950s? She was suffering enormous pangs of conscience, almost unbearable. And she wanted some sort of redemption from Malcolm X, and he basically told her to go fuck herself. Just drove the knife in perfectly at the perfect moment to cause maximum damage to a person who is unbelievably vulnerable. And at that moment, he grasped what he had done. Is there any degree of suffering that we can say is not valid, not legitimate? And what does that do to the overall value of suffering in general? If I can say that first world problems are less legitimate than real problems, say in the third world, presumably that's what that means, then you're denigrating the overall actual value of suffering in and of itself, aren't you? If somebody actually is suffering, somebody stubs their toe, and we compare that to somebody having an ice pick driven into a particularly sensitive part of their body, we can say that stubbed toe is nothing. Really. Why is the person jumping around on one foot, screaming and cursing? Think about that, eh?